I want to tell you something I've never told anyone outside of a courtroom. I want to tell you about the morning I knelt in the red clay dirt of Hollingsworth Cemetery, in the county where I was born, in the county where I thought my wife of 31 years had been buried 4 months earlier. And I want to tell you what a stranger said to me when I stood back up. She said, "Excuse me, sir, I don't mean to intrude, but the woman in that photograph on your flowers, I've seen her. She was here yesterday, standing right where you're standing now." My hands were shaking. I couldn't speak, because the woman in that photograph was Lorraine Pruitt, my wife, dead, according to a death certificate signed in Biloxi, Mississippi, on March 7th. Dead, according to the funeral I sat through. Dead, according to the headstone I had paid $200–400 to have carved. Dead, according to my own son. My name is Walter Pruitt. I'm 63 years old. For 31 years, I drove long-haul freight across 17 states, mostly the Gulf Coast corridor, Mobile to El Paso and back, sometimes up through Tennessee, sometimes down to the Florida Panhandle. I drove a Kenworth T680. I hauled refrigerated produce and dry goods, and I came home every 2 weeks smelling like diesel and highway coffee. I wore the same 3 flannels in rotation. I drove a '97 Silverado with a cracked dashboard and 220 0 miles on it. I had a modest house on 4 acres outside of Hattiesburg, Mississippi, with a tin roof and a back porch that needed repainting. Nobody in my life would have looked at me and seen anything worth stealing. That was their mistake. I learned something in 31 years of driving long-haul freight. You see a lot of country alone in that cab. You think. You watch. You learn to read the road 100 yards ahead of where everyone else is looking. And what I learned about people is this. The ones who underestimate you are always the most dangerous, not because of what they'll do to you, but because of what they'll do when they think you're not watching. Let me take you back to the beginning. Lorraine and I had 2 children. Our daughter Cassidy, who was 34 at the time all of this happened, married, living in Baton Rouge with her husband and 2 little boys. And our son Derek, who was 37, living in a rented house in Gulfport, working what he called consulting work, which I later learned meant he moved between failed ventures the way some men move between bar stools. Restless. Always on the edge of something big that never quite arrived. Lorraine was diagnosed with congestive heart failure in the winter of our 28th year of marriage. The diagnosis came from Dr. Emile Brossard at Forest General, a kind man who pulled me aside after the appointment and spoke to me quietly in a hallway that smelled of antiseptic and floor wax. He told me her heart had been operating at 34% ejection fraction for what he estimated was probably 2 to 3 years. He told me she'd been quietly compensating. He told me to prepare myself. I drove home that evening and sat in the truck in the driveway for 40 minutes before I went inside. We had 27 good months after that diagnosis. Slower months, front porch months. I took early retirement from the freight company. We cooked together more. We argued less. She planted roses along the fence line even though her cardiologist had told her to take it easy. And I pretended not to notice because I knew that woman needed to do something with her hands, or she would lose her mind. And then, on a Tuesday morning in February, she had a cardiac event in the bathroom while I was out buying groceries. And when I came home, she was gone. Or at least, that is the story I lived with for 4 months. I want to describe the grief of those 4 months, because it matters. It explains why I didn't see what was right in front of me. I stopped eating properly. I lost 17 pounds. I sat in her chair at night because it still faintly smelled like the lilac soap she used. I drove out to Hollingsworth Cemetery twice a week, sometimes more, because being near the stone with her name carved in it was the closest thing I had left to being near her. Derek came around more after the funeral. He seemed, and I want to say this carefully because he was good at it, he seemed genuinely broken up. He would sit with me on the porch, drink coffee, talk about his mother. He cried twice in front of me in that first month, and both times it looked absolutely real. I reached over and put my hand on his shoulder the way you do for a child who is grieving. I remember thinking, maybe this is how we finally become close. I want to remember that moment now, because of everything I know. And I want you to understand how completely, how surgically, how deliberately he constructed that performance. About 6 weeks after the funeral, Derek started bringing up the trust. My father, a man named Cecil Pruitt, who had worked for 40 years in the Mississippi timber industry and built a small fortune that nobody in our family fully appreciated until after he died, had established a family trust in 1987. The trust held, at the time of my wife's passing, approximately $3 million in managed assets. It was an irrevocable trust with a specific trigger structure. My father had believed in protecting family money from divorce, litigation, and impulsive decisions. The trust had been structured so that the full corpus would be accessible to the surviving spouse, meaning me, only upon the death of the last named beneficiary. Lorraine was the last named beneficiary. Her death, if legitimate, unlocked $3 million. What Derek and Lorraine had not counted on was one specific fact that neither of them knew, because neither of them had ever thought to look closely at the trust documents that lived in a fireproof safe in my office. I wasn't just a beneficiary, I was the sole trustee. I had been the sole trustee since 1994, when my father signed over control to me and told me in his quiet way that he trusted me more than he trusted anyone else in the world to protect what he'd built. "Walter," he said, "smart men hide their money in banks. Wise men hide it in plain sight, in the names of people nobody suspects." I never told Lorraine. I never told Derek. I never told Cassidy. The trust had a corporate attorney on retainer, a man named Gerald Moss, 64 years old, who had managed my family's legal affairs for 22 years. Gerald was a compact man with silver reading glasses and the unhurried manner of someone who had seen every variety of human greed and could no longer be surprised by any of it. He called me every December with a trust review. We had lunch once a year at a place in Hattiesburg that served the best red beans and rice in the county. Gerald was the only person alive, outside of me, who knew the full picture. The first time Derek brought up the trust, I let it pass. He mentioned it gently, almost apologetically, said he'd been having a look at Dad's old paperwork, said he wanted to understand what the family assets looked like now that Mom was gone, said he wanted to make sure everything was in order. I said I'd look into it. He nodded. He poured us both more coffee. The second time he brought it up, 3 weeks later, he had a man with him. He introduced the man as Neil Garber. Mid-40s, dark suit, firm handshake, one of those flat smiles that doesn't reach the eyes. Derek said Neil was a financial advisor he trusted, said he'd helped several of his friends restructure inherited assets, said he just wanted me to hear what he had to say. Neil Garber spent 20 minutes explaining how I could streamline access to the trust corpus, move the assets into a more liquid vehicle, and then simplify the structure in a way that would, in his words, benefit the whole family. He used the phrase, "everyone wins here," twice. He slid a document across my kitchen table. It was a trustee resignation form. I looked at it for a long moment. I kept my face completely still. I thought about my father sitting in his truck in 1994, the light coming through the pine trees, telling me to hide things in plain sight. I said, "I appreciate you coming out, Neil. Let me think on it." He said, "Of course, Walter. Take your time." He did not know I had already decided. That night, I called Gerald Moss. I told him what had happened. There was a silence on the line. Then Gerald said, quietly and precisely, "Walter, don't sign a single piece of paper. Don't acknowledge the trust exists to anyone. Give me 72 hours. I said, "Take what you need." 3 days after that meeting, I drove out to Hollingsworth Cemetery on a Thursday morning in late July. The air was heavy and hot, the way it gets in Mississippi in summer, the kind of heat that sits on your chest. Magnolias along the cemetery fence, the smell of cut grass and red dirt. I knelt at Lorraine's grave. I prayed. I set down the small bunch of yellow daisies I'd bought at the Piggly Wiggly because she had always preferred ordinary flowers to expensive ones. I said the things you say when you are alone at a gravestone. And then I stood up, and a woman touched my shoulder. She was about 55, gray-streaked hair pulled back, wearing a nurse's uniform under an open cardigan. She had the apologetic expression of someone about to say something they're not sure they should say. "Excuse me, sir," she said. "I live just across the road. I walk through here most mornings. I don't mean to intrude." I waited. "That photograph on your flowers," she said. "That woman. I've seen her. She was here yesterday, standing right where you're standing now." The world went very quiet. "I only noticed because she was so well dressed for a cemetery," the woman continued. "Silk blouse, good shoes. She had flowers too, but she put them in her bag before she left, like she thought better of it." I said, "What time?" "Early, just past 7 in the morning." I looked at the photograph tied to the daisy stems with a piece of twine. It was Lorraine, our 25th anniversary photograph, the one I kept in my wallet. I said, "Thank you." I drove home. I sat in the truck in the driveway for a long time. My hands were steady, which surprised me. I'd expected them to shake. I called Gerald Moss again. I said, "Gerald, I need Ray Caulfield's number." Ray Caulfield had spent 28 years as an investigator for the Mississippi Insurance Commission before going private. He was 61, heavy-set, meticulous in a way that had nothing to do with his appearance. He wore rumpled clothes and drove a car that looked like it had survived a flood, but every file he compiled was perfect. Every photograph was dated, time-stamped, cross-referenced. He had exposed 14 fraudulent death claims in his career and had a specific distaste, he told me once, for people who faked grief. I met Ray at a diner off Highway 49, the kind of place with vinyl booth seats and a ceiling fan that didn't quite make a full rotation. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting. He ate a piece of pie, then he slid a notepad across the table. He said, "Day 1. What do you know for certain?" I told him, "Death certificate signed by a Dr. Antoine Cavalier at Biloxi Regional. Cremation arranged by Derek. No body viewed. I had been told by my own son that Lorraine had expressed a wish not to be viewed. Ashes in an urn on my mantle that I had never confirmed were hers." Ray wrote it all down. He said, "Who is Neil Garber?" I said I didn't know beyond what Derek had told me. Ray said, "I will know by Friday." I drove home. On the way, I passed the cemetery. I did not stop. Day 4. Ray called. Dr. Antoine Cavalier had surrendered his medical license in Louisiana in 2019 following an investigation into fraudulent death certifications. He had relocated to the Mississippi Gulf Coast and was operating under a shell consulting structure. He had signed at least 3 suspicious death certificates in an 18-month window. The Mississippi State Insurance Fraud Unit had an open file on him. Neil Garber had 2 prior civil judgments against him in Georgia. He was not a licensed financial advisor in Mississippi. He had been the instrument of a similar scheme in Savannah 3 years prior, an elderly widower, a sizable estate, a trustee resignation obtained under false pretenses. That widower had lost $890 dollars before his own daughter noticed. Day 7. Ray had a photograph, taken at a Walgreens pharmacy in Ocean Springs, Mississippi, on a Tuesday afternoon. A woman at the prescription counter. The woman was Lorraine. She had dyed her hair darker and cut it short, but the bone structure, the way she held her chin, the particular angle of her shoulders. It was my wife. I knew her body the way you know the shape of a road you've driven 1,000 times. She was picking up a prescription under the name Carol Devereaux. I sat with that photograph for a long time. I felt things I do not have clean words for. Grief and rage and something colder than either of them. The particular silence of understanding a thing you cannot undo. I did not call Derek. I did not call Lorraine. I did not drive to Ocean Springs. I called Gerald Moss and I said, "Gerald, what do I need to do to protect the trust completely and permanently before any external party can touch it?" Gerald said, "I've been waiting for you to ask me that. I've already drafted the paperwork." Day 9. Ray met me again at the diner. He slid a folder across the table. Inside, photographs of Lorraine and Derek together at a rental property in Long Beach, Mississippi, a lease in the name of Carol Devereaux. Bank records showing a joint account opened 3 weeks before the supposed death. Derek's name, Lorraine's new name. The account had received $187,000 in deposits from a liquidated joint investment account that had been in both our names, money she had moved without my knowledge in the 6 weeks before she died. She had been planning this for at least 9 months. There was also a name, a woman named Patricia Suggs, 58 years old, living in Mobile, Alabama. Ray had tracked her down through the Insurance Commission files. Patricia's husband had died of a legitimate heart attack 4 years ago. Derek had been his financial advisor. Derek had convinced Patricia to put her $340 $0 life insurance settlement into a fund he controlled. By the time Patricia understood what had happened, $312,000 of it was gone. Patricia had filed a complaint. Nothing had come of it. Ray said, "I think your son has done this before. Your wife may be a first-time participant, or she may not be. Either way, they were counting on the trust being accessible within 30 days of the death certification." I said, "It won't be." Gerald had already moved. As sole trustee, I had exercised my authority to restructure the trust into a restricted charitable remainder vehicle, meaning the corpus was now legally inaccessible to any beneficiary without an 18-month review period and dual trustee authorization. In practical terms, the $3 million was untouchable. Not by Derek, not by Lorraine, not by Neil Garber, not even by me acting alone. They had planned to steal $3 million. They had already missed it. Day 11. I called Monica Tate. Monica Tate was a special agent with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, based out of the Jackson Field office. I did not know Monica personally, but Ray Caulfield did. They had worked 2 cases together during his time at the Insurance Commission, and he described her as someone who did not need to raise her voice to make a room go quiet. She was 52, moved through the world with the deliberate economy of someone who had heard every lie and could smell the architecture of one before it was finished. Ray made the introduction. Monica met us at Gerald's office, a converted Victorian on Oak Grove Road in Hattiesburg. Bookshelves floor to ceiling, a conference table of dark mahogany that Gerald had inherited from his own father. 2 windows overlooking a garden that was slightly overgrown and perfect. I laid out everything. Monica listened. She read every document Ray had compiled. She asked 12 precise questions. She made 7 notes. Then she looked at me and said, "Mr. Pruitt, do you want to do this right?" I said, "I want my son to have the opportunity to stop." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "I can give him that opportunity inside a courtroom. I need to tell you about the week before the confrontation, because I think this matters more than the confrontation itself." I called Cassidy. Cassidy was my daughter, 34 years old, a middle school science teacher, living in Baton Rouge with her husband Marcus, and 2 boys, ages 7 and 4. She had always been closer to her mother than to me, in the way that daughters often are. She had grieved hard after the funeral, and I had watched that grief and said nothing, because at that point, I knew nothing. Now I knew everything, and I had to choose whether to protect her from it or prepare her for it. I drove to Baton Rouge on a Friday. I sat at her kitchen table, sticky with the evidence of two small children, a crayon drawing of a horse taped to the refrigerator, the smell of something good on the stove. Cassidy poured us both sweet tea. She looked at me the way she always did when she knew I had something hard to say. Arms folded, jaw set, the same expression her mother used to wear. I said, "Cassidy, I need to tell you something about your mother and your brother." She said, "Dad, what is it?" I started from the beginning. I talked for 40 minutes. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she pressed both hands flat on the table. Her voice was very controlled. She said, "How long have you known?" I said, 11 days. She said, "You drove out here because you didn't want me to find out in a courtroom." I said, "Yes." She looked out the window. Then she said, "Is Mom okay physically?" I said, "She appears to be fine." She said, "What happens now?" I said, "Now I let the people whose job this is do their job. My part is almost done." She reached across the table and took my hand. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. I had not held my daughter's hand since she was maybe 12 years old, and sitting at that sticky kitchen table in Baton Rouge, with the crayon horse on the refrigerator and the sweet tea getting warm, I thought about how many years we had let pass without doing something as simple as that. I drove back to Hattiesburg the same night, day 14, a Thursday. Derek had been pushing for a meeting about the trust. Gerald had, on my instruction, been stalling professionally, bureaucratic delays, document requests, compliance holds. Derek was getting impatient. Neil Garber had called Gerald's office twice. Gerald had noted both calls, dated, time-stamped. Gerald set the meeting for Thursday at 10 a.m. in his office. He told Derek it was a routine trustee review meeting, that they would go over the structure of the trust and determine next steps. He told Derek to bring anyone he felt was appropriate. Derek brought Neil Garber. He did not bring Lorraine, which told me he still believed I didn't know she was alive. I arrived at Gerald's office at 9:47 a.m. I wore a clean flannel shirt, the one without any paint stains. I drove the Silverado. I parked in the back. Monica Tate's vehicle was already in the lot, unmarked. 2 other vehicles I didn't recognize. I walked in through the side entrance and sat in the chair that Gerald had placed at the far end of the mahogany conference table. There was a glass of water in front of me. The bookshelves were full. The garden outside the window was grey in the morning overcast. Gerald sat across from me. We said nothing. We waited. At 10:03, Derek and Neil Garber walked in. Derek saw me and paused for just a fraction of a second. He recovered immediately, smiled, came over, touched my shoulder, said, "Dad, glad you could make it." His handshake was warm. His eyes were already scanning the room. Neil Garber shook my hand and said, "Good to see you again, Walter." He set a leather portfolio on the table. The portfolio had his initials embossed in gold. Gerald opened the meeting. He thanked everyone for coming. He said he had a few items to go over regarding the trust structure. He said there had been some recent developments. Derek said, "What kind of developments?" Gerald said, "I'll let Mr. Pruitt explain." Derek looked at me. I said, "The trust has been restructured as a charitable remainder vehicle, as of 9 days ago. The corpus is restricted for a minimum of 18 months under dual trustee authorization. There is nothing to access, transfer, or liquidate." The silence was total. Neil Garber opened his portfolio. He looked at a page. He looked at Gerald. He said carefully, "I'm not sure that restructuring would be valid without full beneficiary consent." Gerald said, "As sole trustee, Mr. Pruitt has complete unilateral authority over structural decisions. The restructuring is fully documented, fully legal, and fully irrevocable. I filed the papers with the state 9 days ago." Derek said, "Dad." I said, "There's more." I reached into the folder in front of me and pushed 3 documents toward the center of the table. The first was a copy of the photograph Ray had taken at the Walgreens in Ocean Springs. The second was the lease agreement in the name of Carol Devereaux. The third was a copy of the joint bank account statement, Derek's name, Lorraine's new name, $187, dollars in deposits. Derek stared at the photograph. Neil Garber closed his portfolio and stood up. He said, "I think there may have been a misunderstanding about the nature of this meeting. I'm going to—" Monica Tate opened the door. She had 2 colleagues with her. She identified herself, badge out, calm as a winter morning. She said, "Mr. Garber, please sit back down." He sat. She turned to Derek. She said, "Derek Pruitt, we have a warrant for your arrest on charges including conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, mail fraud, and filing a fraudulent death certificate in the state of Mississippi." She cited the specific statutes in a flat, unhurried voice. She said there was a coordinated arrest being executed simultaneously at the Long Beach property. Derek looked at me. I have thought about that look many times since. It was not the look of a man who was angry. It was the look of a man who had run a calculation in his head and arrived at the answer too late. It was the look of understanding, arriving at exactly the wrong moment. He said, "Dad, I can explain." I said, "I know you can." I said nothing else. There was nothing else to say. He was placed in handcuffs at 10:19 a.m. Neil Garber was taken out separately. The gold-initialed portfolio sat on the mahogany table after they were gone. Nobody picked it up. Lorraine was arrested at the Long Beach property at 10:22 a.m. She had been inside. She offered no resistance, according to the report Monica gave me later that afternoon. I have been asked many times how I felt in that moment. I have been asked if I was devastated, or vindicated, or relieved, or numb. The honest answer is that I felt something that didn't have a clean name, something like the feeling at the end of a very long drive, when you finally see the off-ramp you've been watching for. Not joy, not peace exactly, but the cessation of a particular kind of vigilance. I drove home. I sat on the back porch with a cup of coffee. The 4 acres were quiet in the way that Mississippi land is quiet in the afternoon. Insects, distant crows, the tick and sway of the pine trees along the fence line. My wife had planted roses there. They were still growing. Nobody had tended them in 4 months, and they had kept growing anyway, the way living things do when you're not looking. I should tell you what came after, because the ending matters as much as anything that came before it. Derek Pruitt pled guilty to 3 federal charges, including conspiracy to commit mail fraud and filing a falsified government document. He was sentenced to 47 months in federal prison and ordered to repay $312 as an rosiro to Patricia Suggs of Mobile, Alabama, the woman whose settlement money he had taken 4 years earlier. Patricia Suggs sat in the courtroom during sentencing. She did not look satisfied. She looked tired. She looked like a woman who had been waiting a long time for something that still didn't quite feel like enough. I understand that feeling. Lorraine pled guilty to 1 count of insurance fraud. She received a suspended sentence of 36 months with 5 years of supervised probation. She was ordered to make restitution of $187,000 to the joint account she had drained. She relocated to a city I don't know and don't ask about. Neil Garber was separately prosecuted in Georgia for the Savannah case. He was convicted on 6 counts. He is currently serving a 9-year sentence. Dr. Antoine Cavalier surrendered to the Mississippi State Attorney General's office. His case is still pending. The trust remains in the charitable remainder structure. I have been advised that after the 18-month review period, I can restructure it as I see fit. I have not decided what I will do with it. My father built that money with timber work and patience over 40 years. I intend to be patient with it. 3 weeks after the sentencing, Cassidy drove up from Baton Rouge on a Saturday. She brought her 2 boys. The older one, whose name is Cecil, named for my father, which still catches me sometimes, spent the afternoon helping me repaint the back porch railing. He was 7 and serious about it, in the way that 7-year-olds are serious about things that give them a brush and a job. He got more paint on himself than on the railing. We laughed about it. Cassidy and I sat in the same chairs on the same porch her mother and I had sat in for 20 years. The roses along the fence line had put out a second blooming, late season, stubborn, absolutely unaware of everything that had happened. Cassidy said, "Are you okay, Dad?" I thought about it. I said, "I think I'm getting there." She said, "I keep thinking about all the times I called Mom and didn't call you." I said, "You didn't know?" She said, "I know, but still." We sat for a while. Cecil came around the corner with paint on his elbow and a look of tremendous satisfaction. He showed me his section of the railing like he was presenting evidence at a trial. I told him it was the best section. He nodded very seriously. Cassidy said, "She planted those roses." I said, "She did." She said, "I don't think I want to pull them out." I said, "Neither do I." Here is what I know now that I didn't know at the beginning of this story. I know that grief can be manufactured just as easily as it can be real. I know that a person can sit across a table from you, hold your hand, cry at a funeral, and be lying with every cell of their body. I know that people you love are capable of things that will take the floor out from under you, but I also know this. When you have spent 31 years of your life driving alone through the dark across 17 states, you develop a certain relationship with silence. You learn to sit with hard things without flinching. You learn that the road looks different at 3 a.m. than it does at noon, but it is still the road. You get through it the same way you get through everything, 1 mile at a time, headlights on, watching the lane ahead. My father told me in 1994 to hide the important things in plain sight, in names nobody suspects. He was talking about money. But I think he meant something larger than money. I think he meant, be the quiet one. Be the one they overlook. Be the one who doesn't need to announce himself, because the people who announce themselves are the ones who show you exactly what they're afraid of. The sweetest part of all of this was not the courtroom. It was not the handcuffs. It was not watching Neil Garber's gold-initialed portfolio sit abandoned on a mahogany table. It was a 7-year-old boy named Cecil, painting a porch railing on a Saturday afternoon, elbow deep in white paint, completely unbothered and entirely his own. That is what I was protecting. That is what it was always about. Not the money, never the money. The things that keep growing when you're not looking. The things that were never theirs to take.